Hi there, and we're back for another live Q&A session all about OET. My name's Rebecca, and I'm going to be here with you for the next hour, answering any questions you might have about preparing for your OET test. And that test might be coming up in a matter of days or weeks. It could be coming up later on in this year. And as we always say, it doesn't matter where you are in your preparation journey. If you're near the beginning or getting close to the end, if you have a question that you'd really like answered about getting ready for OET, what are the best strategies? What should you focus on? Do we have any information about a particular topic? This is a really great place to get that reassurance, to get those answers, to hear from OET Live about the best ways that you can prepare for the test. So thank you to everybody joining live so far. It's great to see a number of you joining on both of our social media channels on YouTube and Facebook. And if you have a question that you'd like to ask me, it's very, very simple. You just need to go to the comments box below where this is live streaming for you, type in your question, and they come through to me here, and I pick them up and work my way through as many of them as I can in the next 60 minutes. There are no silly questions. Each session that I run on Q&A is completely different. I never know what to expect, but if it's something that is puzzling or concerning you, I'd love to be able to help you out, to give you some advice and to reassure you. So let's have a look at what's coming through so far. All right, here's the first question that's coming through on YouTube: how to solve reading part A. So I'm actually going to go straight to some tips that we have prepared about reading part A. I'll just hide that comment so that you can all see those tips on the screen now. So reading part A does cause candidates a little bit of concern, and mostly that concern comes to the 15 minutes that you're allowed to complete those 20 questions. Now, the reason for that is a good one. The reason that we only give you 15 minutes is because the way that OET is designed is in conjunction with healthcare employers, healthcare regulators, and they told us a long time back now that healthcare professionals in the workplace often need to be able to quickly synthesize information from written text to decide on a course of action for a patient. And they have a time pressure to do that. There isn't always the opportunity to read carefully, to study in detail before making a decision. And so reading part A is preparing you for that workplace skill that you'll need to demonstrate. There are some tips that you can follow, though, to stop you from getting overly stressed during the test. And the first one is the last tip that I've got on the screen here, which is don't panic about the time. Panicking never helps anybody. Perhaps I sometimes talk about remembering your first experience of taking blood from a patient. The idea of sticking a needle into a patient's arm was probably quite scary. You might have felt concerned that you were going to hurt them. You wanted to take your time. If somebody had stood there with a stop clock and said, you've got to do this in 10 seconds, it would have made you feel even more nervous and probably made your hand shake a fair amount. So don't panic about the time. This is something that can be done in 15 minutes. It's all just about training yourself to be able to do it. And the ways that you can do that training is to do the questions in order. So this is tip 1. The questions are written in a particular order to assist you, particularly those first questions, the matching questions, have been designed to assist you get a global understanding of the contents of the 4 texts. And so answering those questions first gives you then more clues as to where you will find the answers for the remaining questions once you start working through those. Also, while doing those first sets of questions, really make use of the text features to help you quickly find the answers. And what I mean by text features are the titles that come with each text, maybe subheadings or subtitles. If you've got a table, it could be the column headers or the row headers. It could be bulleted lists of items. These text features help you quickly move between different parts of information that the text contains and help you also locate the answers more quickly. And my final tip for reading part A is don't waste marks unnecessarily. Our assessors tell us that a lot of candidates, in fact, most candidates, will always lose 1 or 2 marks from reading part A unnecessarily because they haven't checked the spelling of their answers are accurate. And in reading part A, your answers must be 100% accurate because you are copying information directly from a text. The answer is given to you in the text. And again, this is something you will be aware of in healthcare. Accuracy is critical, sometimes fatal if something is written down incorrectly. So we are checking that you can copy information accurately with correct spelling into your answer. So once you've written your answer down, just spend another few seconds checking that the spelling is accurate so that you're not wasting any marks. All right, hopefully that helped with questions about reading part A. Let's have a look for the next question. Mariam on YouTube says, in listening part A, spelling is not important, but it's computer checked. How is it possible? Because computers cannot make mistakes. So I'm just understanding, I'm going to paraphrase your question slightly. I think you're asking, is spelling important in listening part A? And just to confirm your understanding that listening and reading part A are marked by human assessors, 2 human assessors. Only parts B and C of listening and reading, the multiple choice questions, are computer marked. So whether you take OET on paper or OET on computer, listening and reading part A is human marked. And they are using an answer key like those that you can find on the sample test page of the OET website to decide if your answer is correct or incorrect. Now, in terms of whether spelling is important in listening part A, it is, of course, important to be as accurate as you can in all parts of the test with your spelling. As I just mentioned, in reading part A, it is critical. You must get your spelling 100% accurate. But with listening and writing as well, you should aim to be as accurate as possible. And during the 2 minutes that you are given to check your answers for listening part A, spelling is one of those things that you should be checking, as well as the legibility of your answers. Is it possible for the assessors to clearly read what you have chosen? Now, if you're taking OET on computer, obviously legibility isn't an issue because you have typed your answers, but you do need to still check in the computer version of OET that your spelling is as accurate as possible, particularly with common words. And by common words, we mean those words that would be very familiar to patients as well as to healthcare professionals. So the names of symptoms, for example, we would be expecting you to spell correctly because those are very common words in English that someone at your proficiency level would be expected to spell correctly. So there is some flexibility in terms of spelling with more complicated words. But remember that complicated words are not necessarily longer words. There are still very high frequency words, very common words, for example, like cholesterol, that is very commonly known to patients as well as to healthcare professionals, that we would expect you to spell correctly. It's not considered a complex word. So do aim to be as accurate as you can with your listening spelling. Pamela, also on YouTube, is asking about clubbing, which means combining 2 test scores from 1 test sitting. And you're saying that for your first test, you got 2 Bs, a C+, and a C. Now, in terms of whether these scores are going to be acceptable or not, it really does depend on the regulator that you are applying to, because OET results are now accepted around the world, in the US, in the UK, in Australia, but also places like Ireland and New Zealand. And each of those regulators have slightly different requirements, which on the positive side means that your results are quite powerful. If you have no particular preference where you want to start your new healthcare career, you can actually shop around with your results and make a decision on what you already have, where that would be accepted. But if you are aiming for a particular country, the best place to check is with the regulators themselves from their website. And I can post the link into the comments box about all of the regulators that accept OET results. And in that list, you will find their website, where you can then contact them to check what requirements they have in terms of combining test scores, the required minimum scores, resits, and that sort of thing. Kennedy on YouTube says, do we get penalized if we use the word like moreover and furthermore in OET writing? So the main focus of the OET writing test is the clarity of your communication with the reader. And you can see this from the assessment criteria that are used for OET writing. There are 6 assessment criteria. And these are testing you on things like whether you've included all of the contents that the reader needs to be able to continue care, whether you have omitted unnecessary details that would delay the reader from fully understanding the information that you are providing. It's also testing you, though, on things like how you are organizing the information to be clear as possible for the reader, and whether you are using an appropriate genre and style, so an appropriate style of writing between healthcare professionals. Now, the appropriate style between healthcare professionals is formal. And when it comes to formal writing, it means avoiding things like unnecessary use of abbreviations, contractions where you reduce a word. So, for example, saying can't instead of cannot. That's not a typical feature of formal writing. Now, within formal writing, there are different layers. For example, if you were a lawyer writing about a legal case, your level of formality would be quite a lot higher than the letter that you are writing for healthcare. And the essay writing, which is used for academic writing, is also a slightly higher level of formality. And these connectors, furthermore and moreover, are actually much more suited to essay writing than letter writing. And so we do advise candidates not to mix the style of their writing to try and keep the formality suitable for healthcare writing. However, to specifically answer your question, if you have included words like furthermore or moreover in your letter, those words on themselves wouldn't have a significant impact on your final score. They might have a minor impact on your score for genre and style, that assessment criteria that I've just been mentioning, particularly if there are lots of other features in your letter that are not at the correct level of formality or suitability for healthcare writing. But if those were the only 2 exceptions and the rest of your style was appropriate, by themselves, they're not going to have, as I say, a significant impact. Another question about possible penalization in writing. Do we get penalized if our letter is 240 words long? So if you have a look at a sample test on the OET writing pages, you'll notice that at the end of the writing task are a few guidance points, things like expand the notes into full sentences. The guided word limit is given as between 180 to 200 words. And remember, the word limit is for the body of the letter, which are the paragraphs that you're writing. The body does not include the address, your salutation, greeting, or ending, the closing sentence, and that. It is just the paragraphs in the main part of your letter that is within that guided word limit of 180 to 200 words. And the reason for setting that guidance is because you only have 40 minutes to write your letter. And so we're encouraging you that is the number of words required to communicate this information to the reader accurately. Now, the assessors are not going to count your words one by one to check whether you have fitted within that guided word limit. But what they are looking for, as I mentioned in my last response, is whether you have provided sufficient content for the reader to be able to continue care, and whether you have omitted unnecessary details and summarized the important information effectively. Now, when candidates end up with a letter where the body count is around 240 words, that usually suggests that unnecessary details have been included, or perhaps the writer hasn't been able to summarize the details of the case notes as effectively as would be possible. So it is certainly a skill to work on. Summarizing notes succinctly, which means into as few words as possible to still communicate the main idea, is a skill, and it does take practice. But as I said, if everything ends up being completely relevant, you've summarized reasonably effectively, again, a letter, that is slightly over that word limit may not have too much of a significant impact on your score. Alb says how to sign up for an online course. On the OET page, it directs you to secondary pages, and it's really confusing which class to pick. All right, so I'm going to just provide that link for other candidates in the session who might also be interested in how to choose a suitable online course. So we recommend a number of preparation partners, and they are listed in this link here. And as Alb has mentioned, you are directed to contact them yourselves through their website. Now, when it comes to deciding which provider partner is going to be the right one for you, it's like choosing anything. It's about doing a little bit of research. It's about having a look at their websites, looking at what options they have available, perhaps when they have class times running. Are those class times going to be suitable for where you live in the world? Are you able to choose just the skills you want to practice? Are they suitable for someone completely new to OET? Are they suitable for someone who has tried OET before and is now looking for some remedial support? So ask yourself these sorts of questions. Contact some of these providers. You can contact them via email or through their website. Ask them some questions. Tell them what it is that you're looking for. Let them respond to you and engage in conversation, and make your decision based on the information that they tell you. Often choosing a teacher is different from candidate to candidate. There can be something quite personal about someone you preferring working with. Some people prefer to work with a teacher of the same gender. Some of you are not particularly worried about that. Some of you might prefer someone who has a healthcare background. All of these things are possible from that list of provider. But what we can say is that anyone provided on that link with our premium provider logo is directly endorsed by us. They have completed thorough training with OET. We know that they have appropriate teacher qualifications. We know that they have the ability to really make a difference to your scores and to your test results. So you can trust any of those providers that are listed on that page, but it really comes down to your personal preference about which one you might like to work with and to do your preparation with. Alice on YouTube says, what is the best strategy for answering listening part C? So again, I've got some tips that I can bring up onto the screen. So let me bring those up and hide your question, Alice. So a few tips here for answering listening C. As you know, listening C are two longer recordings. There are two extracts in listening C, and usually one will be an interview of a healthcare professional talking about the work that they do, and the other will be a presentation by a healthcare professional, again, talking about the work that they do, the research that they've been conducting, a case study to do with the area that they work in, and so on. So these types of recordings are of interest and relevant to you as a healthcare professional. And there are 6 questions to answer for each of those extracts. So my first tip is really to make use of the reading time that you're given before each of those extract audios start. So you're given 90 seconds to read the 6 questions before the audio plays. And during that 90 seconds, the first thing that I would do is to read just the question for each of the questions. So each of the 6 questions, read the question line. What is the question asking you to do? That gives you an overall understanding of the contents that you're about to listen to. It starts activating any vocabulary that you might know to do with that topic, which is useful to engage your listening skills. It also is a useful thing to do because this will tell you when the audio is moving on to the next question. And so it's good to sort of have that in your mind. Once you've quickly looked at the 6 questions, then go back and start looking through the 3 answer options for each question. And what you're really looking at in those answer options is what makes them different. So what is the one word or couple of words that really makes answer option A different from B and C? Because then what you're going to listen for is those areas of difference being mentioned. And that will then help you focus in on deciding, is that answer correct or incorrect? So really use your reading time effectively. Look through the questions, spend all of that time focusing on the questions and the answer options. Once the audio starts, it's really important that you keep your focus. It's so easy for your brain to wander somewhere else, to think about what an answer to part B or part A in the listening test, or to think about what the reading test coming up might be like. You really must keep your focus because otherwise it's so easy for you to miss something that the speaker has said, and that will then make it much harder for you to answer the question accurately. And the third tip is related to that as well. Once it's clear that the next question has begun, either because the interviewer asks the speaker the next question, or you pick up from the cues in the question that the presenter is moving on to the next question, you also need to move on to that next question so that you're not missing key details that you need to be able to answer the next question correctly. So don't sort of keep thinking about the question that you were listening to. Move on, come back if you have to, and think about that question some more during the time you're given to check your answers. All right, all good questions coming through. Let's have a look on what other questions are coming in. Here's a question on speaking. We haven't answered any speaking questions yet today. So from Vina on YouTube, how can I improve my speaking, like showing empathy in voice modulation and intonation? Well, Vina, I think one of my main suggestions would be to listen to speakers of English and listen to how they show empathy when speaking to patients. And a really good way of doing this is watching some TV programs that are healthcare related. And there's a lot that you can find on YouTube. A couple of good examples around the world, in fact, in Australia, the US, and in the UK, there are examples of a similar program, which is 24 hours in a hospital emergency department. So it might be, for example, 24 hours in A&E, I think is the UK version, 24 hours in King's Cross, I think is a version here in Australia, and they have a similar version in the US as well, again focusing on an emergency department. And you can listen to healthcare professionals having that initial consultation with patients, gathering information from them and showing empathy to the patient's situation. And really listen out for how they show that empathy with their voice modulation and intonation. Because if you come from a language which is more monotone in terms of modulation and intonation, it can be quite hard for you to start working on including variety when you're speaking. I also think the other part of modulation is making your voice sound empathetic. So, for example, if you say, "I'm sorry to hear that," it's quite monotone, but the voice has a sort of hard quality to it. Whereas you can soften your voice. "I'm sorry to hear that." You can make the voice sound softer, and that's a key part of empathy. It needs to sound the way that the words that you're saying mean. So watching TV programs, listening to podcasts, where again the speakers are needing to show empathy, can be a really good way of picking up those skills. And then it's all about practicing them in a mirror, practicing them with colleagues, asking for their feedback, practicing them with patients. Sometimes candidates tell us that having focused on those skills during their OET preparation, they've noticed a difference when they've tried them out with their patients. They found that the patients are much more responsive to them, or they tell them more details because they find that the empathetic approach encourages them to do so. Debbie on YouTube says, I'm really confused as to what not to repeat in reading part A from the text. Another example, what is the cause of tuberculosis? In the text, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. What should be the answer? Debbie, it's really difficult to talk about specific answers, particularly when I'm not sure that this has come from an official OET sample test, because I can't therefore tell the accuracy of this question and whether it's actually been written to an OET standard. But what I can tell you about avoiding repeating words is that in the question, if there is a word that has been used, so for example, like you're saying, what is the cause of something, you wouldn't usually repeat the name of the disease within your answer. You just need to provide the name of the bacterium. If you're being asked, for example, how many milliliters of saline should be given, you don't need to add the measurement ml for milliliters on the end. You only need to provide the number. So words that are provided in the question or synonyms of words that are then used in the text do not need to be repeated in the answer. And we've got a really good video on this, which is on our YouTube channel. Let me just bring up the link for you to it. And this is all about common mistakes candidates are making in reading part A. So here we go. Let me copy the link and post it into the comments. This is a really useful video for anyone with these sorts of questions. Mark on Facebook says, are they going to collect the answer sheet in part A before the start of part B reading? Yes, they will, Mark. So part A is completed completely separately. After the 15 minutes are finished, your part A booklets are taken away and part B and C booklets are distributed. And it's the same if you're taking OET on computer. At the end of the 15 minutes for part A, those answers are submitted into the computer system before the text and questions for parts B and C become available. Hamid on Facebook says, is the gender of the interlocutor the same with the role play gender in speaking? So Hamid, if you look at official OET sample tests, and let me just find the link to those for you, you will notice that on the speaking role cards for official tests, a gender is not given. We always refer to the patient as he or she, because on test day, we cannot tell whether the interlocutor for you specifically is going to be male or female. So we don't provide a gender. We also never name the patient on an official OET role card. So the gender of your patient will become the gender of the interlocutor that you have. So the card will say he or she. You will then choose the appropriate pronoun to use with the gender of the interlocutor that you are taking the test with. Carlo on YouTube says, in the writing test, if there are too many medications and diagnostic results, can we write that the results and current medications were enclosed with the letter? Now, again, this really comes down to whether you are working with official OET sample tests, because OET sample tests are carefully written to include information that can be communicated within 40 minutes. So when you say things like too many of something has been included, to me that says you're not working with official OET materials. It may be that in an official set of OET case notes, a lot of medications and diagnostic results are given. But if you look at the scenario that you're writing about, you'll then be able to tell that some of those medications are not relevant to the person that you're writing to. Perhaps they have since ceased to be used since the patient's been discharged from hospital, or they're related to another condition that this reader is not monitoring or providing a second opinion about. And the same with diagnostic results. Maybe all of those diagnostic results are not of interest or relevant to the reader based on the care that they're going to be providing to the patient. So this is part of your test, looking through the case notes that have been included and deciding what information is relevant to the reader. Anything that is relevant to the reader should be included as a detail in your letter. We don't encourage using that phrase that you've mentioned of saying that they've been enclosed with the letter, because anything that is relevant should be within your letter, and anything that isn't should be omitted. So it's really about making that decision, checking that you're looking carefully at the reason for writing to the reader, and using that to make decisions about what information to include or omit. Lekha on Facebook says, is it okay to use Ms. for a widow patient? Now, this is something that candidates fairly often ask, and I think perhaps this must be culturally different for some countries as to how they refer to widows. Usually in English-speaking countries, a widow retains her married pronoun, which is Mrs., because she is considered still married, even though her husband has now died. However, you don't need to guess with OET official case notes. They will always provide the title that you should use for the patients, particularly for female patients, so you don't need to guess which title is appropriate for you to use. But as a point of interest, widows in English-speaking countries continue to use the title of Mrs. Even after their husband's death. Aditya on YouTube is saying, how can I get quality material for listening? Well, the best place to go for quality material is the OET website, and I'm posting a link to the Learn pages of our OET website. Here you can find materials for each part of the OET test, including official sample tests. Once you have made use of all of those materials, I'd also recommend visiting the OET store, where we have a number of additional preparation materials. Some are course books, some are further practice test sample books, a variety of print material, online material that you can use to further practice your skills. And you might also consider, as I was discussing earlier, studying with one of our recommended preparation partners who can also focus specifically on just listening if you've identified that as an area of weakness for yourself. Ruth on YouTube says, what is the best way to start the role play in the speaking test? There isn't one best way to start the role play, and this really comes down to how life is replicated in the OET speaking test. You don't always start speaking to your patients in exactly the same way. Sometimes when you've met the patient several times before, you'll start with a greeting, whereas if you're meeting the patient for a first time, you'll start with an introduction. So it really does depend on the background information that you're given on your role card as to the decision you make about how to start the role play. What I would recommend that you do, though, is that you write down either on the roll card if you're taking OET on paper, or on the piece of paper that you're allowed in the test room if you're taking the test on computer. I would write down how you plan to start the role play during your 3 minutes preparation time, because that means you'll then be able to start the role play confidently. And it also means that you don't fall into that trap of panic when the interlocutor says, can you start the role play now, please? Because some candidates are much further down the task points at that moment where the interlocutor says, can you start? They sort of go back and think, oh, how was I going to start this role play? So if you've got it written down, it avoids that moment of panic for you. And remember that you're trying to demonstrate variety to the interlocutors. So it's really good practice to start the 2 role plays that you will complete in your test differently, just as a simple way of demonstrating variety and appropriacy, that you know that different patients require different ways of starting a conversation. Joan on YouTube says, in writing, can I include the full name of the patient in the introductory paragraph or just the surname? Joan, it is recommended as best practice that the full name of the patient is used in the introduction paragraph. If you're asking, can I just use the surname, that would never be considered accurate in English. You would always use the patient's title as well as their surname. That's considered a polite way to write about a patient. But in the introductory paragraph, using their title, first name, and family name is, as I say, considered good practice. After that, in the subsequent paragraphs, the first time that you mention the patient, their title and family name, if it's an adult patient, is considered appropriate. And for subsequent uses within the same paragraph, you can use a pronoun, he or she, his or her, instead of their name each time. Vina on YouTube says, can we write anything on the reading and listening question papers, like underlining keywords or highlighting important points? Yes, absolutely, you can. Your question paper is yours to do with as you wish. So if during the time that you have during the reading test or before the audio starts, you want to underline something, you're welcome to do so. If you're taking OET on computer, you can also highlight questions or words in the question if that helps you before you listen or during the reading test. On computer, in the reading test, you can also highlight the texts in a similar way that on the paper version of OET, you again can underline in the text if that helps you. Gianna on Facebook says, for writing, is it okay to only cross out the word rather than using an eraser? Yes, that's absolutely fine and acceptable. It's really your personal preference. And this also sometimes comes down to whether you're writing in pen or pencil. But in either pen or pencil, if you prefer to just cross out the mistake that you've made and then continue writing after that, absolutely fine. If you are using an eraser, that's also fine. Just make sure that you completely erase what you want to be disregarded before you write over the top of it. Alina on YouTube says, can you explain the April 29th test letter? Alina, I'm afraid I can't. I haven't seen the OET test papers. In fact, I never get to see the papers that candidates use on test day. So I've no idea what the test was on that day. And also test materials do remain confidential outside of the test room. That's something that you sign on the front page of all of your test booklets, that you understand these materials are confidential. So I'm afraid it isn't something that we can discuss publicly. Syed on Facebook says, how can we test our writing when we're practicing at home? So Syed, my recommendation would be to use the assessment criteria. And you can find the assessment criteria from the test overview pages. If you click on the tabs on this page for writing And for speaking, you'll find at the bottom of the information about those tests links to the assessment criteria. But what I'm actually going to do is to share my screen just to make sure everyone is familiar with how these assessment criteria look and how you can use them for your practice at home. Let's just make them slightly bigger. Okay, so these are the assessment criteria. As I mentioned, you can find these from the test overview page on the OET website. If you're aiming for a 350 or higher, you are really aiming for scores along this central line. So a 2 in purpose and a 5 in all of the other assessment criteria. So what you should be doing whenever you complete a piece of practice is to look at your letter against these assessment criteria. Have you met the requirements in this level? If you have, that's fantastic. If you haven't, then this is what you should be aiming for and something that you can work on for next time. Having said that, it is good practice to use those criteria in that way. But if you really want to be confident about the skill of your writing, what sort of score you might be writing at this point, the best way to get that kind of feedback is from one of those recommended endorsed teachers that I spoke about earlier in the session. They have been trained by us to be able to offer guidance and feedback on your writing and your speaking, and they can really identify strengths and weaknesses for you and provide you with support as to how you can work on those weaknesses. Jay on YouTube says, in listening and reading part A, can I use lowercase letters? Yeah, absolutely you can. Some candidates taking OET on paper particularly feel concerned about the legibility of their handwriting, or they're just more familiar with writing everything in capital letters. If that's your preference, you can write your answers that way. But for everybody else, just writing in normal script is absolutely fine and appropriate. It really comes down to your personal preference. Lise on YouTube says, what if the interlocutor is female, but she assumes a male role? That isn't going to happen on test day. They will play their own gender during the listening test, the speaking test. So that isn't something that you need to worry about. Newman on Facebook says, is it necessary to use the past tense in your letter? Newman, I would say it is likely to be very necessary. If you're writing about a patient, their history and their current situation plus any future action points, you're going to use a variety of all of the tenses in your letter: present tense, present perfect, as well as past simple. You may even use some continuous tenses. You're likely to need a variety of tenses, but particularly to report history, previous events that are completed, previous test results that have happened, assessment of the patient in the past. You will need to be able to use the past tense for that section of your letter. This is a sort of follow-up question to one I answered earlier from Dr. Asma, who says, do I have to erase underlined questions and options at the end of the test? Does it affect my score if I don't erase? No, there's absolutely no requirement for you to do that. You just need to make sure that your final answers are very clear for the assessor. In part B and C of listening and reading, that means making sure that the shaded answer is really clear, that the computer can read it. And you don't really want any marks or writing within, imagine a sort of thin rectangle around those answer boxes. You don't really want any marks within those boxes that could confuse the computer, but there's no need to erase marks purely for aesthetic purposes. Nagensny is saying, is it possible to have more free practice material for OET at home, as we only have one for nurses? So the good news is there is a second nursing writing task now available. We have 4 sample tests for candidates taking OET on computer or OET at home available on the OET website. So if you visit the sample test pages, you'll find that there are 4 sample tests available, 2 specifically for nursing, but the other 2 which cover the medicine test, the listening and the reading tests will work for you the same, because all of our professions take the same listening and reading test. So you can use all 4 to practice your listening and reading parts of the test. And I would suggest for the writing test, you could just open up a word processing document and type your answer in there. If you're able to use a split screen on your laptop or PC, you could put the case notes up on the screen and just type your answer next to them to get that same function for writing. But you can use all of those sample tests available to practice listening and reading. Another question from Dejana on Facebook. In listening part A, is it allowed to answer using abbreviations? The answer strictly is no, unless the speaker themselves provides the answer as an abbreviation. So, for example, if they'd said COPD, for example, as an answer, that would be allowed because they've actually spoken aloud an abbreviation. But for all other answers, you should write full words as you hear them in the audio, because the guidance is to write what you hear in the audio. So you're not supposed to change the wording in any way when you write down your answer. Emma on YouTube says, is it accurate to use suffering from and complaints of in the letter? Complaints of is definitely a standard term that is used throughout healthcare writing. There's absolutely no issue with that. Suffering from is also considered a standard term in healthcare writing. However, it is a term that healthcare how would I describe it? Healthcare systems, I suppose, are moving away from it. It's now considered more of a subjective term. The patient might not agree with your assessment that they are suffering from a condition, particularly a chronic condition. So our advice is really save suffering from for acute conditions, particularly those involving pain. And for chronic conditions, you can swap it out for something like experiencing, or even just has. So, the patient has asthma, the patient has diabetes, and that avoids any of that subjectivity that is beginning to be accepted in healthcare systems. It is started to be moved away from. Ziomara on YouTube says, from which exam date does the 10 days result publishing apply for OET at home? I believe that is active from now. So those of you who may have seen the posts that we've put on social media, the emails that have gone out announcing that results for computer and at home are available more quickly now, that is already active. So if you took the test last weekend, I believe that your results will be available within that time frame. Dr. Asma on YouTube says, how do we write an urgent referral letter? What to write first? So towards the beginning of the session, I talked about the different assessment criteria that you are being scored on, and deciding on what order to write information comes under the assessment criteria, organization and layout. And at the same time, I was mentioning that the most important aspect of the OET writing test is that you are clearly communicating the information to the reader. And that comes down to how you organize the information. You are trying to decide what information the reader would find most significant, and then to organize it in that order. So they're receiving the information in the way that they want it. Now, when the situation is urgent or an emergency, you will usually mention that during your introductory paragraph to make sure that the reader understands the importance and urgent nature of this situation. Once you've told somebody that a situation is urgent, what they're going to want to understand next is what makes this urgent, what makes this an emergency. They don't want you to go back to 6 months prior when the patient first presented. They want to know what's happening now, what has just happened to create this to be an urgent situation. So the organization that we recommend for urgent letters is that you explain in the introduction the reason for writing, as you would in any letter, and then you provide the most recent detail. After that, you can go back through the history, but you may find that some of that historical information has been superseded by more recent events. And that is also part of the test, to recognize that that information has been superseded and doesn't need reiterating, restating, repeating. So think about, as I said, for any letter that you write, not just for urgent letters, think about the reader. What information does the reader need? What order do they want that information presented in? What will make it most clear for them to understand how they are being asked to help assist this patient? Vina on YouTube says, do we get penalized if we don't write an article in reading and listening part A? If you have a look at official OET sample tests, you will notice that articles generally do not form part of the mandatory answer. You'll notice that some words are given in brackets on the answer key. Anything in brackets is optional. So if you have included it, it won't be penalized. If you have omitted it, equally, it's not penalized. Articles are not usually part of what's mandatory in the answer to get it correct. Joanne on Facebook has a question on answering reading B and C. I'm going to pick up on reading B for now. So let's bring up the tips and just hide your comments. Because a lot of the tips that apply for reading part B can also work really well in reading part C. So a few tips here, remembering that part B, there are 6 texts, each with an independent question about it. And these are typical texts that you'll find in your workplace, perhaps displayed on the staff room notice board, maybe that you'll receive as an email or a memo from your line manager. So you really approach each question individually. There's no relation between the 6 questions. Each one is independent. So start afresh with each question. It's really important that you find evidence to support your choice, so that the correct answer will be fully supported with evidence in the text. If it's only partially supported, or it's not really stated, but there's a word that is repeated from the question and the answer, that's not enough. You need to find actual evidence to support the whole of the answer option that you're choosing. And you'll also be able to find evidence as to why the other answer options are incorrect. And that's also a good skill to develop. But for now, really make sure you're focusing on which evidence you can find to support the text and answer option. And then the other tip for reading part B is to help you with what I've just mentioned, finding that evidence. read the question that you think contains the answer more than once. So don't make a really quick decision. Look at the sentence, really check, does that meet all of the answer option before making your selection. So hopefully those are a few tips to help you there. I've got time just for a couple more questions. Let's have a look at this one. This question from Mariam says, is there any chance that reading might be reduced to C+, like in the US and other places? So Mariam, as I mentioned earlier in the recording, this is a decision made by the individual regulator in those specific countries. And what I was saying earlier was your results are quite powerful in that you can choose, when you've got your result, where you want to go to with that result. If you've only got a C+ in reading, you might be able to already apply with a regulator in one country, but it's not something OET has any control over. We do not set the scores required for each country. That comes down to the regulator. All right, and the final question that I'm going to answer today is Abdallah on YouTube, who's saying, I'm wondering if prolonged looking at my card during the speaking role play might lead to any negative implications. If it's not impacting your fluency, it's not going to be impacting your assessment as such, because the assessors are only using the audio recording of the role plays. They don't get to see, even if you're taking OET on computer, they don't get to see the recording of the video. They only hear your responses. We do recommend you try to make eye contact with the interlocutor as a natural part of speaking. It helps to create rapport. It also helps you in a way to feel more comfortable because, excuse me, when we speak with patients or during test situations, it is a natural part of human behavior to make eye contact with the person that we are talking to. So of course, look at the roll card whenever you want. If you find it really difficult to make eye contact, as I say, there's no particular implication on your result to studying or looking down at the role play all the time. The only time where it would really impact your score is if it's impacting your fluency, and that could happen in a couple of ways. One, if you are looking at your roll card rather than listening to the patient, that might prevent you from responding appropriately to what the patient has just said. Or because you're reading and studying the card so much, it's impacting the speed and the fluency of your speech. All right, some great questions from today's session. Just before we finish up, I want to let you know about other live sessions that are coming up across our social media channels from our OET preparation partners. So next Tuesday, our partners at WLES are going to be leading a live session on listening part B. So those of you who are asking for tips and strategies for listening, that will be a great session for you to watch. And next Thursday, our partner at SET English are going to be doing a session on organizing your letter. So there were a couple of questions coming up today specifically on organizing your letter. I'd really recommend that session for any of you who are asking those questions. Those sessions are streaming through Artificial OET social media channels. If you're unable to join them live, you will be able to see a recording after the event. And of course, next Friday is International Nurses Day. So I want to wish any of you joining today's session who are nurses a happy International Nurses Day. And even more closely than that, tomorrow is International Midwives Day. So if we have any midwives joining today's session, I hope you have some nice ways to celebrate planned for tomorrow. Now, the next Q&A session is going to be in 2 weeks' time with my colleague Shekinah. It's going to be on Wednesday, the 17th of May. You can see the times when that will be streaming on your screen now. So do join Shekinah in a couple of weeks if you have more questions that you'd like to be answered by OET. And in the meantime, you can also submit questions to us through Facebook Messenger on our Facebook page. Those come through to the education team, and we try and get a response back to you within 24 hours. So there's lots of ways that you can continue with this support even after today's session has finished. Just finish by saying thank you very much for joining me today. It's always a pleasure to help and answer your questions, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you. Bye for now.